Sometimes the most expensive promise in the world begins with two strangers signing a piece of paper neither of them believes in. The rain had been falling over Manhattan for 3 straight hours, turning the city lights into blurred streaks of gold and silver across the glass walls of Hayes Global Headquarters. 48 floors above the crowded streets, Alexander Hayes stood alone in his office, staring at the contract resting on his desk. At 37, he was one of the youngest billionaires in America, the kind of man financial magazines called brilliant and ruthless in the same sentence. Tonight, however, he looked less like a powerful CEO and more like a man running out of time. The board meeting was less than 72 hours away. If he failed to satisfy a clause hidden inside his grandfather's trust agreement, control of Hayes Global could pass into the hands of relatives who had spent years waiting for him to stumble. The requirement sounded absurd for a modern corporation. Married. He needed to be legally married before the vote. Not engaged. Not dating. Married. Alexander let out a slow breath and loosened his tie. He had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions, survived hostile takeovers, and rebuilt companies from the ground up. Yet somehow the biggest threat to his empire was a document written by a stubborn old man who had believed family created stability. A knock interrupted the silence. "Come in." The door opened, and his attorney stepped inside carrying a thin folder. "She's here." Alexander glanced at the folder. "You're certain she understands the arrangement?" "Completely." "And she still agreed to meet?" The attorney nodded. She didn't have many options. Something about that answer settled heavily in the room. 20 minutes later, Alexander entered a private conference suite overlooking the city. The room was elegant but cold, all glass, steel, and polished marble. At the far end of the table sat a young woman wearing a simple navy dress. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap. She looked nervous but determined. Hannah Collins, 24 years old, art restoration specialist. No criminal record. No scandals. No connections to the business world. Just a woman carrying more burdens than most people twice her age. Alexander noticed the worn strap on her purse. The repaired seam near her sleeve. The way she sat perfectly still, as if one wrong movement might break whatever fragile stability remained in her life. Hannah looked up when he entered. Their eyes met for the first time. For a brief moment neither spoke. Outside, thunder rolled across the city. "Mr. Hayes," she finally said. "Miss Collins." His attorney quietly closed the door behind them. The click echoed through the room. Alexander took the seat across from her and slid a thick document onto the table. The contract stopped between them. Hannah stared at it. So did he. It looked ordinary enough. White paper. Black ink. Yet both of them knew their lives could change because of the signatures waiting at the bottom. "I believe you understand why you're here," Alexander said. Hannah swallowed. "Yes." "Then I'll be direct." He folded his hands. "I need a wife." The words sounded strange even to him. Hannah gave a nervous laugh that disappeared almost instantly. "And you think that wife should be me?" "For 1 year." Her eyes widened slightly. Alexander continued. "You'll receive financial security, housing, and enough money to solve every problem currently threatening your family." Hannah's expression shifted. Not greed. Not excitement. Pain. The kind of pain that comes from someone exhausted by circumstances they never chose. Alexander noticed it immediately. "In return," he said quietly, "you'll marry me." The room fell silent. Rain tapped against the windows. Somewhere below, New York kept moving, unaware that two strangers were sitting 48 floors above the city, about to make a decision neither would ever forget. Hannah lowered her gaze to the contract. Then she whispered 6 words that changed everything. "What happens if I say yes?" Hannah did not answer immediately. Her fingers rested on the edge of the contract while the city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls. Alexander had expected hesitation. What he had not expected was the sadness that crossed her face. It was the look of someone standing at the end of a road with nowhere left to go. Finally, she lifted her eyes. "If I say yes, my family is protected?" Alexander nodded once. "Every debt listed in the financial review is paid in full." Hannah looked away. The financial review. Even hearing those words felt strange. Over the past week, strangers had examined every painful detail of her life. The overdue medical bills, the notices from the bank, the shrinking savings account, the apartment she was days away from losing. Most importantly, the mounting costs of her younger brother's treatment. Ethan Collins was only 16 years old, but his heart condition had already stolen years from him. Hannah had spent most of her adult life fighting battles he never even knew existed. "And my brother?" she asked quietly. "His care continues without interruption," Alexander replied. "The best doctors available." Silence settled between them again. Hannah lowered her head. A memory surfaced without warning. 3 nights earlier, she had sat beside Ethan's hospital bed while he slept. The room had smelled faintly of disinfectant and warm blankets. She had watched the steady rhythm of the monitor and wondered how much longer she could keep pretending everything would be fine. She had smiled whenever he looked at her. She had promised him she would find a way. The truth was she had no idea how. Her restoration work barely covered rent. The small museum that hired her part-time had recently cut staff hours. She had sold jewelry, furniture, even treasured art books she had collected since college. Yet every month the numbers became worse. Every month another letter arrived. Another payment. Another impossible choice. "Miss Collins." Alexander's voice pulled her back to the present. Hannah realized she had been staring at the contract for nearly a minute. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I was thinking." "About your brother?" She looked surprised. "How did you know?" Alexander hesitated. "Because every answer you have given today has been about someone else." For the first time since entering the room, Hannah seemed uncertain how to respond. Alexander leaned back slightly. Most people who sat across from him wanted something. Promotions, investments, influence, attention. Yet this woman appeared willing to sacrifice her own future simply to help someone she loved. It was unfamiliar, uncomfortable even. Outside, rain continued sliding down the glass in silver streams. "There is something you should know," Hannah said suddenly. "If I agree to this, I am not doing it for money." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Then why?" "Because my brother deserves a chance at a normal life." Her voice trembled slightly. "And right now I cannot give him that on my own." The honesty in her words lingered in the room. Alexander found himself looking at her differently than he had an hour earlier. Not as a solution. Not as a contract. As a person. A tired, determined person carrying far more than she should. Hannah took a slow breath. Then she reached for the pen resting beside the contract. Alexander watched carefully. One signature would solve his crisis. One signature would change both their futures. Hannah positioned the pen above the paper, but before the tip touched the page, she asked a question that neither the attorneys nor investigators had prepared him for. "Tell me something honestly, Mr. Hayes. Have you ever loved anyone enough to give up everything for them?" Alexander did not answer immediately. The question lingered between them like the distant sound of thunder beyond the glass walls. For the first time that evening, the billionaire looked away. His gaze settled on the rain-covered skyline stretching across Manhattan. Thousands of lights glowed against the darkness, yet none of them seemed to hold the answer Hannah was waiting for. Finally, he spoke. No, the honesty surprised her. "No," she repeated softly. Alexander shook his head. "I have cared about people. I have trusted people. But I have never loved someone enough to give up everything." His voice remained calm, but something behind it felt older than his 37 years. When you spend most of your life building something, you learn to protect it. Hannah studied him carefully. "That sounds lonely." A faint smile appeared on one corner of his mouth. "It probably is." Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Hannah looked back at the contract. She thought about Ethan. She thought about the stack of unpaid bills sitting on her kitchen counter. She thought about the call she had received that morning from the hospital administrator asking when the next payment would arrive. Most of all, she thought about her brother's smile whenever he talked about the future. College, baseball games, road trips, ordinary things most teenagers took for granted. He still believed those dreams were possible. Hannah refused to be the reason they disappeared. Slowly, she lowered the pen to the paper and signed her name. The sound of ink moving across the page seemed louder than the storm outside. Hannah Collins. One signature. One decision. One future she could no longer take back. Alexander watched in silence. The crisis, threatening his company, suddenly felt farther away. Yet instead of relief, an unexpected weight settled in his chest. This agreement would save him. It would also completely alter the life of the woman sitting across from him. Hannah slid the contract forward. There. Alexander glanced at the signature. Then he picked up his own pen. Within seconds, his name appeared beneath hers. Alexander Hayes. The agreement was official. His attorney entered the room moments later and collected the documents. "Congratulations," he said with a professional smile. "The paperwork will be filed first thing tomorrow morning." Hannah almost laughed at the word congratulations. Nothing about this felt like a celebration. The attorney left, carrying the contracts away. For the first time, Hannah and Alexander were alone without papers separating them. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we prepare for a wedding." Hannah blinked. "How soon?" 48 hours. Her eyes widened. 48 hours? The board vote is Monday morning. Hannah leaned back in disbelief. "I do not even know your favorite color." "Blue," Alexander answered automatically. For some reason, that made her smile. A genuine smile. Brief, but real. It caught him off guard. "And yours?" he asked before thinking. "Green." The conversation stopped again. Yet the silence felt different now. Less tense. Less transactional. Hannah gathered her purse and stood. Alexander rose as well. For a moment, they faced each other beneath the soft lighting of the conference room. Two strangers. Future husband and wife. The idea still felt impossible. As Hannah reached for her purse strap, a folded white handkerchief slipped from the side pocket and landed on the floor. She quickly bent down and picked it up. Alexander noticed the careful way she handled it. "Important?" he asked. Hannah looked down at the neatly folded cloth. A small sadness crossed her face before she smiled. "It belonged to my mother." Alexander nodded. He did not know why, but the image stayed with him as she walked toward the door. The handkerchief, the worn purse, the determined woman carrying responsibilities far heavier than herself. Hannah paused before leaving. "Mr. Hayes?" "Yes." She hesitated. "I hope this helps both of us." Then she disappeared into the hallway. Alexander stood alone in the conference room long after she was gone. Outside, the rain continued falling over Manhattan. And for the first time in years, he found himself wondering whether the greatest risk he had taken was not for his company at all. 48 hours later, the wedding lasted less than 20 minutes. There were no grand floral displays, no orchestra, and no crowded ballroom filled with smiling relatives. The ceremony took place inside a quiet private chapel overlooking the Hudson River. A gray sky stretched above the water, and a cool autumn breeze drifted through the trees surrounding the property. Hannah stood beside Alexander beneath a simple arrangement of white roses, listening as the officiant recited words that sounded strangely distant. Everything had happened so quickly that her mind still struggled to catch up. 3 days ago, she had been calculating overdue bills at her kitchen table. Now she was legally married to one of the wealthiest men in America. When the ceremony ended, cameras flashed briefly for corporate records, attorneys exchanged paperwork, and the small gathering dispersed almost immediately. There was no kiss for the photographers, no dramatic celebration, just signatures, handshakes, and obligations fulfilled. By late afternoon, a black luxury sedan carried Hannah toward her new home. She sat quietly beside the window, watching Manhattan disappear behind them as they entered one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. Alexander sat across from her in silence, reviewing documents on a tablet. Neither seemed to know what newly married people were supposed to say in a situation like this. Eventually, Hannah broke the silence. "Do you always work on weekends?" Alexander glanced up. "Most of the time. Even on your wedding day?" A faint smile appeared. "Especially on my wedding day." Hannah shook her head softly and looked back outside. 20 minutes later, the vehicle turned through a set of iron gates nearly 12 feet high. The estate beyond looked more like a private resort than a residence. Long stone pathways curved through manicured gardens. Fountains sparkled beneath soft lights. Beyond them stood a massive 3-story mansion built from pale limestone and glass. Hannah stared through the window. "People actually live in places like this?" she whispered. "Apparently," Alexander replied. The car stopped beneath a covered entrance. Staff members waited near the doorway. A butler opened the door for Hannah. She stepped onto the stone driveway and suddenly felt completely out of place. Her entire apartment could have fit inside the mansion's front hall. Inside, polished marble floors reflected warm chandelier light. Paintings lined the walls. A sweeping staircase curved upward toward the second floor. Hannah noticed several employees standing nearby. Most offered polite greetings. A few simply observed her with professional curiosity. She could almost hear the questions behind their expressions. Who is she? Where did she come from? Why did he marry her? Alexander seemed unaffected. "Your room is prepared," he said. Hannah blinked. My room. The East Wing. And yours? West Wing. Understanding dawned on her. The marriage contract. Separate lives. Separate spaces. Separate expectations. Right, she said quietly. Of course. A house manager guided her upstairs. As they walked through hallways longer than some city blocks, Hannah tried to memorize every turn. The mansion felt beautiful, but strangely empty. Eventually, they reached a large suite overlooking the gardens. The room contained tall windows, a fireplace, a sitting area, and shelves filled with books. It was larger than any place she had ever lived. After the manager left, Hannah placed her purse on a table and slowly sat on the edge of the bed. The silence felt enormous. She reached into her purse and removed her mother's folded white handkerchief. Holding it carefully between her fingers, she walked toward the window. Far below, she noticed Alexander crossing the courtyard alone. Even surrounded by unimaginable wealth, he somehow looked isolated. Hannah watched him disappear through another doorway. Then she looked around the unfamiliar room and wondered which would be harder to survive during the next year: living inside a billionaire's world or discovering the man hidden behind it. The first week inside the Hayes estate felt like living inside a museum where everything was beautiful and nothing belonged to Hannah. Every morning she woke before sunrise, still surprised by the quiet. No traffic outside her window. No neighbors arguing through thin apartment walls. No hospital bills waiting on the kitchen counter. Yet despite the luxury surrounding her, she often felt more unsettled than comfortable. On Tuesday morning, she wandered downstairs searching for coffee and accidentally entered a dining room large enough to host 50 guests. A long table stretched beneath crystal chandeliers, but only one person sat there. Alexander was already dressed for work, reviewing financial reports while drinking black coffee. He glanced up briefly. "Good morning." "Good morning," Hannah replied. She hesitated before taking a seat several chairs away. The distance felt ridiculous. "You know you can sit closer," Alexander said without looking up. "I know. Then why are you sitting halfway across the county?" The unexpected comment caught her off guard. A laugh escaped before she could stop it. Alexander looked up, almost surprised by his own joke. For a brief second, the tension between them eased. Later that afternoon, Hannah discovered a different side of the estate. While exploring a hallway near the service wing, she noticed an elderly man struggling to carry several heavy storage boxes. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his uniform identified him as part of the household staff. "Please let me help," Hannah said immediately. The man smiled politely. "That is very kind, Mrs. Hayes, but I can manage. Only if you want to spend the rest of the week with a sore back." Before he could protest, she picked up one of the boxes. The man laughed softly. "You sound like my daughter." Together, they carried the boxes into a storage room. His name was Walter. He had worked for the Hayes family for more than 30 years. During the next hour, they talked while organizing old records and decorations. Hannah learned about the estate, the staff, and even stories from Alexander's childhood. Most employees, Walter admitted, were still unsure what to think about the sudden marriage. They expected a socialite, he said carefully. Someone from Alexander's world. Hannah smiled. "I am definitely not that." "No," Walter agreed warmly. "You are not." Over the following days, she continued helping whenever she could. She learned the names of gardeners, cooks, drivers, and housekeepers. She listened more than she spoke. She remembered birthdays and asked about families. Slowly, the guarded expressions around her began to soften. What Hannah did not realize was that someone was paying attention. One evening, Alexander stood on a second-floor balcony overlooking the courtyard. Below, he watched Hannah sitting beside Walter on a garden bench. The older man appeared tired, rubbing his shoulder while she spoke with concern. A few minutes later, she disappeared inside and returned carrying a blanket and a cup of tea. Walter's grateful smile was visible even from a distance. Alexander remained motionless. He had spent years watching people impress investors, manipulate negotiations, and chase opportunities. Yet Hannah never seemed interested in any of those things. She treated the billionaire and the groundskeeper with exactly the same kindness. For reasons he could not explain, he found that difficult to ignore. As darkness settled over the estate, Alexander finally turned away from the balcony. But one question followed him back inside. If Hannah could make complete strangers feel valued within days of meeting them, why did it seem impossible for her to see her own worth? By the second week, Hannah had settled into a routine that made the enormous estate feels slightly less intimidating. Every morning, she visited her brother before returning home, and every evening, she spent time restoring sketches and damaged artwork in a small sunlit room the staff had quietly transformed into a studio for her. It was the first space inside the mansion that truly felt like hers. One Thursday night, long after most of the lights had dimmed, Hannah sat alone beneath a desk lamp, carefully repairing the corner of an old watercolor landscape. The soft scratch of her brush against paper filled the room. She was so focused that she never heard someone stop outside the doorway. Alexander stood there for nearly a minute watching her work. He had returned from a 12-hour meeting expecting the house to be asleep. Instead, he found Hannah completely absorbed in a world that had nothing to do with money, boardrooms, or corporate battles. "You are still awake?" he finally asked. Hannah nearly jumped. "You scared me." "Sorry." She smiled and set down her brush. "Long day." "Very." His eyes moved to the painting. "What is that?" "A damaged landscape from the 1800s. The museum was going to discard it. And now?" Hannah looked at the artwork with quiet affection. "Now it gets another chance." Something about the answer lingered in Alexander's mind. Another chance. Before he could respond, his phone vibrated. A message appeared on the screen. He glanced down. The sender was a private investigator he occasionally used for corporate matters. The brief report made his expression tighten. Hannah noticed immediately. "Everything okay?" Alexander slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Just business." It was not entirely true. Earlier that week, he had noticed something unusual. On 3 separate evenings, Hannah had left the estate after dinner without mentioning where she was going. She always returned late. Always alone. Always looking exhausted. At first he ignored it. Then curiosity became concern. Now the investigator's report sat in his pocket. Hannah Collins leaves the estate at approximately 7:30 each evening. Destination varies. Activity unknown. Alexander disliked mysteries, especially inside his own home. The following night, after another long workday, he found himself watching from an upstairs window as Hannah climbed into a rideshare vehicle. 10 minutes later, he made an impulsive decision he could not quite explain. He followed. The car traveled across the city before stopping near a modest neighborhood far removed from the luxury of the Hayes estate. Alexander remained parked across the street, confused. Hannah stepped onto the sidewalk carrying a paper bag and entered a small brick building. The sign above the entrance read St. Matthew Community Care Center. He frowned. This was not what he expected. Through the window, he could see volunteers moving between tables. Elderly residents sat talking quietly. Children colored pictures in one corner. Nearly 40 minutes passed before Alexander spotted Hannah again. She was helping serve meals, laughing with an elderly woman, and carrying supplies between rooms. She looked happier there than she ever did inside the mansion. The realization unsettled him. An hour later, as he prepared to leave, he noticed Hannah walk into a private office carrying a thick envelope. She handed it to the director. The woman hugged her warmly. Hannah smiled, but even from a distance Alexander could see worry behind her eyes. Then the director pointed toward a bulletin board. Hannah turned pale. Alexander could not see what was written there. He only saw her expression change. Whatever she had just learned, it clearly mattered. And for the first time since their marriage began, he found himself wanting to know why. The next morning, Alexander could not stop thinking about what he had seen. During a breakfast meeting with investors, his attention drifted. During conference calls, he found himself rereading the same reports twice. None of it made sense. Hannah had every reason to enjoy the privileges that came with their arrangement. Instead, she spent her evenings helping strangers in a modest community center and giving away money she could have easily kept for herself. By noon, curiosity finally overcame restraint. He called his assistant. "Find out everything you can about St. Matthew Community Care Center." "Is there a problem?" she asked. "Not yet." The report arrived less than 2 hours later. Alexander read it alone in his office. The center provided temporary support for families facing medical hardship. One line immediately caught his attention. Emergency Housing Assistance Fund suspended due to lack of donations. Suddenly, he understood the envelope Hannah had delivered. She had not been receiving help there. She had been helping them. That evening, when he returned to the estate, he found Hannah sitting in her studio. Golden sunlight streamed through the tall windows as she carefully restored an old family portrait. For a moment, he simply watched her work. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Hannah looked up, surprised. Of course. Alexander stepped farther into the room. Why do you volunteer at St. Matthew? Her brush froze in midair. For the first time since they met, genuine alarm crossed her face. You followed me? I was concerned. Hannah set the brush down slowly. Concerned about what? About why my wife disappears several nights a week. The word wife felt strange coming from him. Hannah looked away. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she sighed. Because they helped my family once. Alexander remained silent. 3 years ago, she continued softly, my mother got sick. We lost almost everything trying to care for her. She swallowed hard. When the bills became impossible, that center paid for groceries and helped us stay in our apartment. Alexander listened carefully. And now you help them? She nodded. Every month if I can. Even when you were struggling yourself? Hannah gave a sad smile. Especially then. The answer struck him harder than he expected. Most people gave when they had abundance. Hannah gave when she had almost nothing. Before he could respond, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and immediately stood. The color drained from her face. It is Ethan. She answered quickly. Alexander could only hear one side of the conversation. Slow down. Pause. What happened? Another pause. I am coming right now. She ended the call with trembling hands. Is he okay? Alexander asked. Hannah grabbed her purse. His doctor moved up an evaluation. They found something unexpected during testing. Fear filled her voice. Without hesitation, Alexander picked up his car keys. I will drive. You do not have to. I know. 20 minutes later, they were heading toward the hospital through heavy evening traffic. Hannah stared out the passenger window, twisting her mother's white handkerchief between her fingers. Alexander noticed every movement. Whatever happens, he said quietly, you will not face it alone. Hannah turned toward him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she looked down at the handkerchief in her hands and whispered, that is the nicest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time. Neither of them realized it, but somewhere during the drive, the distance created by contracts, obligations, and separate wings of a mansion had begun to shrink. The hospital lobby felt unusually quiet for a Friday evening. Soft lights reflected across polished floors as Hannah and Alexander stepped out of the elevator and walked toward the cardiology wing. Hannah's grip tightened around her mother's white handkerchief with every step. She had spent years walking these hallways, yet tonight felt different. Perhaps it was because she was not alone. When they reached Ethan's room, the 16-year-old was sitting upright in bed, trying and failing to hide his nervousness behind a smile. You made it, he said. Hannah immediately crossed the room and hugged him. Of course I made it. Ethan glanced toward Alexander. And you brought the billionaire. Alexander actually laughed. Good evening to you too. Ethan grinned. Sorry, I am still getting used to this whole situation. The tension eased slightly. A few minutes later, Dr. Reynolds entered carrying a tablet. Hannah stood immediately. The doctor offered a reassuring smile. The additional testing gave us useful information. Hannah held her breath. And the condition is stable. Relief flooded her face. However, the doctor continued, we believe Ethan may qualify for a specialized treatment program that recently became available. Ethan blinked. That is good news, right? Very good news. Hannah closed her eyes briefly as months of fear loosened their grip on her chest. For the first time in a long while, hope felt real instead of distant. After discussing details, the doctor left. Ethan immediately began talking about future plans, college applications, and a road trip he wanted to take one day. Hannah listened quietly, smiling as she watched him dream again. Across the room, Alexander observed the siblings. He noticed how Hannah's entire expression changed around her brother. The constant worry disappeared. The exhaustion faded. She looked lighter, younger, happier. It was impossible not to admire. Later that evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Hannah and Alexander left the room together. The hallway was nearly empty. Through large windows, city lights sparkled against the dark sky. Thank you, Hannah said softly. Alexander looked at her. For what? For being here. You would have done the same for someone you cared about. Hannah smiled faintly. Maybe. They stopped near a quiet waiting area overlooking the city. Neither seemed eager to leave. For a moment, they simply stood side by side, watching traffic move below like streams of light. Can I ask you something? Hannah said. Anything. She hesitated. Why did you really marry me? Alexander expected the question. He just had not expected it to matter. At first, he said, because I needed a solution. Hannah nodded slowly. The answer was honest, even if it hurt a little. Then Alexander surprised both of them. Now I am not so sure that is the whole reason. Hannah turned toward him. Their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them. Not romance. Not yet. Just understanding. Trust beginning to form where none had existed before. A nurse walked by, breaking the moment. Hannah looked away first. We should go. Probably. Yet neither moved immediately. As they finally headed toward the elevators, Alexander found himself thinking about how different everything felt compared to the day they signed the contract. And Hannah found herself wondering a question she had tried very hard to avoid. What would happen if the safest place she had found in years turned out to be beside the one person she was never supposed to love? Over the next several weeks, something subtle changed inside the Hayes estate. The distance that had once defined the arrangement between Hannah and Alexander continued to fade, replaced by a quiet familiarity neither of them had expected. They still occupied separate wings of the mansion. They still followed the rules written into the contract. Yet more evenings were spent talking over dinner than apart. More mornings began with shared coffee than silence. For the first time in years, the mansion felt less like a monument and more like a home. Then everything shifted on a rainy Tuesday evening. Hannah returned from the hospital later than usual. Ethan's treatment plan had officially been approved, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe he would have a real future. The relief left her emotionally exhausted. After entering the estate, she stopped in the library to collect a sketchbook she had forgotten earlier that day. As she stepped inside, she found Alexander sitting alone beside the fireplace. A stack of documents rested on the table in front of him. He looked unusually serious. I was waiting for you, he said. Hannah immediately sensed something was wrong. What happened? Alexander stood and gestured toward the chair across from him. Sit down. Her heart began to race. Slowly she took a seat. Alexander remained standing for a moment before sliding a thick folder across the table. Hannah glanced down at the cover. Legal documents. Her stomach tightened. What is this? She asked quietly. Open it. She carefully turned the first page. The title alone made her freeze. Amendment to Marital Agreement. Hannah looked up immediately. You are changing the contract? Alexander nodded. Yes. Her chest felt suddenly heavy. The fear arrived before logic. Perhaps he regretted the marriage. Perhaps he had found a better solution. Perhaps their arrangement was ending. I understand, she said softly. You do not have to explain. Confusion crossed Alexander's face. Understand what? Hannah forced a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. You have done more for my family than I could ever repay. If you want out of the agreement, I will cooperate. For several seconds Alexander simply stared at her. Then he shook his head. That is not what this is. Hannah blinked. It is not. No, he pulled out the final pages and placed them in front of her. Read section 4. Hannah lowered her gaze and began reading. Halfway through the paragraph, she stopped breathing. If the marriage ends for any reason initiated by Alexander Hayes, Hannah Collins Hayes will retain ownership of the Manhattan residence purchased in her name, a protected financial trust, and full control of all charitable contributions previously designated in her care. Hannah read the paragraph twice before looking up. I do not understand. Then read the rest. With trembling hands she continued. Every amendment removed restrictions that once protected Alexander. Every revision added security for Hannah. Every change shifted power away from him and toward her. When she finally reached the last page, tears filled her eyes. Why would you do this? She whispered. Alexander's answer came without hesitation. Because trust should not only flow in one direction. The room fell silent except for the crackling fireplace. Hannah looked at the documents again, then back at him. In a world where people with power usually demanded more, Alexander had voluntarily given some away. And neither of them noticed that the open folder on the table had just become far more important than the contract they originally signed. Hannah barely slept that night. The amended agreement remained on the small table beside her bed, its pages illuminated by moonlight spilling through the tall windows. More than once she picked it up and reread the sections Alexander had changed. Every time the same question returned. Why? By all logic, he should have been protecting himself. Instead, he had chosen to trust her with assets, responsibilities, and decisions that many people would spend a lifetime trying to obtain. The following morning, she found herself standing outside Alexander's office before breakfast. After a moment of hesitation, she knocked. "Come in." He was already working when she entered. Sunlight streamed across the room, highlighting stacks of reports and financial projections spread across his desk. He looked up and immediately noticed the folder in her hands. "You read everything?" he asked. Hannah nodded. "Twice." Alexander leaned back slightly. "And I still do not understand." A faint smile appeared. "You are not the first person to say that." Hannah stepped farther into the room. "Alexander, these changes could cost you millions." "Possibly. Then why make them?" For several seconds he said nothing. Then he closed the report he had been reviewing. "Because I realized something." Hannah waited. "You have spent months proving who you are." His voice remained calm. "You never asked for more money. You never tried to use my name. You never treated people differently based on what they could do for you." He paused. "Meanwhile, I kept expecting the contract to protect me from risks that no longer existed." The honesty in his words caught her off guard. Before she could answer, a sharp knock interrupted them. Alexander's assistant entered carrying a tablet. Her expression looked unusually tense. "I am sorry to interrupt." Alexander immediately recognized the tone. "What happened?" "The board meeting has been moved forward." His expression hardened. "Why?" "Your uncle requested an emergency review." Hannah watched the change in the room almost instantly. The warmth disappeared. The businessman returned. "What review?" Alexander asked. The assistant hesitated. "Questions regarding governance, leadership stability, and recent decisions involving company assets." Hannah did not need further explanation. Someone was challenging him. After the assistant left, silence settled between them. "Your uncle does not like me, does he?" Hannah asked quietly. Alexander gave a humorless laugh. "My uncle does not like anyone he cannot control." He walked toward the window overlooking the estate. "For years he has wanted influence over Hayes Global." And the marriage stopped him. Temporarily. Hannah joined him near the glass. "Then why would he push now?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "Because he thinks he found another path." Later that afternoon, Hannah accidentally discovered what he meant. While searching for a reference book in the library, she noticed several financial newspapers scattered across a table. One headline immediately caught her attention. "Questions surround sudden marriage of billionaire CEO Alexander Hayes." Another article was worse. "Sources close to Hayes Global suggest marriage was strategic business arrangement." Hannah felt her stomach drop. Someone was leaking information. Someone wanted the public to doubt them. She quickly folded the paper and carried it upstairs. That evening, she found Alexander alone on the terrace overlooking the gardens. Without a word, she handed him the article. He read the headline once. Then his expression darkened. "So it begins," he said quietly. "What begins?" Hannah asked. Alexander folded the newspaper and looked out toward the fading sunset. "The part where people try to destroy something before they understand it." The next few days felt like the calm before a storm. Articles continued appearing online. Anonymous sources questioned the legitimacy of the marriage. Financial commentators speculated about hidden motives. Television hosts debated whether Alexander's recent decisions reflected sound leadership or emotional distraction. Hannah tried to ignore the noise, but it became impossible when strangers began discussing her life as if they knew her. One afternoon, she arrived at St. Matthew Community Care Center and noticed two volunteers whispering while looking at their phones. They immediately looked away when she entered. The realization stung more than she expected. By Friday morning, the situation grew worse. A new article appeared across several major business websites. This time, the accusations were personal. The story suggested Hannah had intentionally pursued Alexander for financial gain and implied that she had manipulated her way into the Hayes family fortune. There was no evidence, no facts, just speculation disguised as reporting. Hannah sat alone in her studio staring at the screen. She had spent her entire life trying to help others, yet suddenly millions of people were being encouraged to believe the opposite. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Alexander stepped inside. The moment he saw her expression, he knew she had read the article. "Do not," he said calmly, "give strangers the power to define you." Hannah forced a smile. "That is easy to say when you have spent your whole life in the public eye." Alexander walked closer. "Actually, it is not." She looked at him. For a moment, he seemed less like a billionaire and more like a man carrying old scars. "People have been writing stories about me for 15 years, he said. Some were true. Most were not. He glanced toward the article on her screen. "The problem is not what they write. The problem is who benefits from it. Hannah frowned. You think your uncle is behind this? I know he is. That evening, Alexander met privately with his legal team. Hours later, evidence began emerging. Several leaked stories had originated from the same public relations firm. The firm happened to have business ties to his uncle, Richard Hayes. The discovery should have been a victory. Instead, it revealed something even more troubling. Someone inside Hayes Global had been supplying private information. The following Monday, the board gathered for the emergency review. Hannah remained at the estate, trying unsuccessfully to focus on her restoration work. Every passing hour increased her anxiety. Shortly after noon, Walter appeared at the studio door. Mrs. Hayes? She looked up immediately. Is everything all right? The elderly man smiled. You should probably turn on the television. Confused, Hannah reached for the remote. A live business network broadcast filled the screen. Alexander stood at a podium addressing reporters after the meeting. Questions came rapidly from every direction. Then one journalist asked the question everyone had been waiting for. Mr. Hayes, was your marriage merely a strategic arrangement? The room fell silent. Hannah held her breath. Millions of viewers waited for the answer. Alexander looked directly into the cameras. His expression never wavered. What began as an agreement became something far more important, he said. And if anyone wishes to question Hannah Collins Hayes, they will have to question me first. Hannah stared at the screen in complete shock. Across the country, reporters immediately erupted with new questions. But she barely heard them. Because for the first time, Alexander had not protected the contract. He had protected her. When Alexander returned to the estate that evening, the atmosphere felt different. News outlets were still discussing his statement, but for the first time in weeks, the conversation had shifted. Questions about Hannah's motives were being replaced by questions about who had orchestrated the attacks against her. Yet none of that was what occupied his mind as he stepped through the front doors. He was thinking about the look on Hannah's face when she had watched the broadcast. He found her in the studio shortly after sunset. The room smelled faintly of paint, old paper, and fresh coffee. She was standing near the window, holding the folded white handkerchief that had belonged to her mother. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Hannah broke the silence. You did not have to do that. Alexander knew exactly what she meant. Yes, I did. You could have protected yourself. I was not interested in protecting myself. Hannah lowered her eyes. The words settled deep inside her. Before she could respond, his phone vibrated. The call came from his legal counsel. Alexander answered immediately. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. When it ended, something had changed in his expression. What happened? Hannah asked. Alexander placed the phone down slowly. We found the source. The source of the leaks? He nodded. One of the senior executives was feeding information directly to my uncle's team. Hannah stared at him. So it is over? Alexander walked toward the window. Beyond the glass, lights glowed across the estate grounds. Not quite. Why not? Because people who spend years chasing power rarely stop after one failure. The following morning, an emergency board session was scheduled. This time, however, the balance had shifted. Evidence linked several attempts to manipulate company governance. Financial records revealed undisclosed relationships between Richard Hayes and outside firms involved in the media campaign. By noon, multiple board members who had previously remained silent began distancing themselves from him. Late that afternoon, Alexander received confirmation that Richard's influence inside Hayes Global had effectively collapsed. The threat hanging over the company for years was finally ending. Yet the most important moment of the day happened far from the boardroom. Hannah was visiting Ethan when his doctor entered with an unexpected update. The treatment program had exceeded expectations. Recovery projections were improving faster than anyone anticipated. Ethan immediately began celebrating. Hannah simply sat down and cried tears of relief she had been holding back for years. When she left the hospital, she found Alexander waiting outside beside his car. Good news? He asked. Hannah nodded through a smile. The best news. Without thinking, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. The hug lasted only a few seconds, but neither moved away immediately afterward. The city seemed strangely quiet around them. You know, Ethan said later that evening during a video call, for two people who claim this is a contract marriage, you are both terrible at acting. Hannah nearly dropped her phone. Alexander laughed harder than she had ever heard. And for the first time since everything began, neither of them corrected him. Because somewhere between the contract, the hospital visits, the public battles, and the quiet conversations late at night, something real had quietly taken root. The only question remaining was whether either of them was brave enough to admit it. 3 months later, spring arrived in New York with clear skies and the kind of sunlight that made even the busiest streets feel hopeful. The crisis surrounding Hayes Global had faded into memory. Richard Hayes was gone from the company. The board was stable. Ethan's health continued improving. And for the first time in years, peace seemed possible. Yet one problem remained unresolved. The contract was approaching its end. Hannah tried not to think about it, but the date lingered in the back of her mind every day. 1 year. That had always been the agreement. 1 year, and then separate lives. The thought hurt more than she wanted to admit. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, Walter appeared outside her studio with an unusually excited expression. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "Alexander asked me to bring you something." He handed her a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. "Meet me on the rooftop at sunset." Hannah smiled despite herself. The rooftop terrace overlooked the entire Manhattan skyline. It had become one of her favorite places in the mansion. As evening arrived, she made her way upstairs. The city stretched endlessly before her, glowing gold beneath the setting sun. Alexander stood near the edge of the terrace waiting. A table sat nearby holding 3 familiar objects. Hannah immediately recognized them. The original marriage contract, the amended agreement, and a framed white handkerchief preserved beneath glass. Her mother's handkerchief. She stopped walking. "Alexander." His expression softened. "Come here." Hannah stepped closer. For a moment neither spoke. The breeze moved gently across the rooftop. Far below, the city hummed with life. Finally, Alexander picked up the original contract. "A year ago, I thought this document would save my company." He looked down at the pages. "I was wrong." Before Hannah could respond, he tore the contract in half. Then again, and again. The pieces drifted into a nearby container prepared for disposal. Hannah stared in complete surprise. Alexander then picked up the amended agreement. This one mattered more. He smiled faintly. "It reminded me that trust is a choice." He placed it aside and turned toward the framed handkerchief. "And this?" His voice grew quieter. "This reminded me who you are." Hannah felt tears gathering in her eyes. Alexander carefully lifted the frame. "The first day we met, I saw a woman willing to sacrifice everything for someone she loved." He paused. "The longer I knew you, the more I realized something." Hannah could barely breathe. "What?" Alexander looked directly into her eyes. "You changed every definition of success I ever had." The city lights began appearing one by one behind them. "You taught me that kindness matters more than status. That loyalty matters more than power. That a home is built by people, not walls." His voice remained steady, but emotion filled every word. And somewhere along the way, the arrangement stopped being an arrangement. Hannah wiped away a tear. Alexander reached into his pocket and revealed a ring. Not extravagant, not designed for headlines. Elegant, timeless, real. "Hannah Collins Hayes," he said softly. "When this began, I thought I was rescuing my future. The truth is that you rescued mine." He took a breath. "Will you marry me again? Not because of a contract, not because of an obligation, not because either of us needs something." His eyes never left hers. "Will you marry me because I love you?" Tears slipped freely down Hannah's cheeks as she laughed and cried at the same time. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes." Alexander smiled, the kind of smile she had once believed he was incapable of giving. As he placed the ring on her finger, applause suddenly erupted behind them. Hannah turned in surprise. Walter, Ethan, members of the staff, and even several close friends stood gathered near the rooftop entrance. Ethan grinned. "About time." Everyone laughed. Under the glow of the Manhattan skyline, surrounded by the people who had become family, Hannah realized something extraordinary. The contract had ended. The promise had not. And as Alexander took her hand and looked toward the future beside her, both of them finally understood that the greatest things in life are never negotiated. They are chosen.